All right. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to wait for folks to filter in. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's midsummer, so you're spending some time with us instead of being outside, so we thank you. Um, okay, and I'm just going to share my screen. And today's session is Service Continuity Planning 101 for Organizations. This session is part of Prepared Together 2025, the Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Virtual Learning Series. As Canadians anticipate more complex and challenging emergency events, the Canadian Red Cross is committed to helping individuals and communities prepare for, adapt to, and respond to disaster risks throughout the year. We will be hosting sessions throughout 2025 in both English and French to support your preparation for emergencies all year long. To learn more about our series, you can visit our webpage links that I will be dropping in the chat momentarily. And just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar is recorded and will be shared with all registrants. Closed captioning is also available for you in both English and French. Just click the closed captioning button in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen. At the end of today's session, we will also have a Q&A period. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box in the control panel. There will be a feedback survey that launches on your browser once you exit today's webinar as well. And we really appreciate your input on how we did today. And if you have any questions about our programming, please email us at rrr@redcross.ca. And the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has seen fundamental principles, which we also honor in Canada. These principles align with Indigenous peoples of Canada's 7 sacred teachings. Where I reside on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, these are also known as the grandfather teachings of wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. Others, such as the Dene laws, IQ values, or Dakota values, are also similar in their teachings. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Emily Rideout to welcome us for the presentation. Thanks so much, Emily.
Thanks, April. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to put my presentation up here. Just give me 1 second, please. And April, please let me know if this is displaying correctly.
Yep, we're not in full screen yet, and now we're in full screen. Awesome.
Okay, great. Okay, hi, everyone. My name is Emily Rideout. I'm a Senior Manager of Preparedness with the Canadian Red Cross. And I want to acknowledge today that I'm joining you from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm so happy to be with you for this session today. So I would love it if you would put in the chat, if you're comfortable, the territory that you're calling in from today, or perhaps where you hail from originally. I'd also love to know in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, telling me a little bit about what sector you work in, for example, healthcare, retail, and so on. I'm very curious to know where folks are calling in from in terms of the type of work they do. And my third question, if you would like to put in the chat, is whether or not your organization has ever done anything like service continuity planning or business continuity planning in the past, or if this is completely new. So I'll take a peek at the chat in just a little bit to find out what you've put in there. And in the meantime, we'll get started. So this presentation, Service Continuity Planning 101 for Community Organizations, is a condensed version of a 5-hour-long workshop on service continuity planning offered by the Canadian Red Cross. So in this presentation, I'll cover what is a service continuity plan, what is service continuity planning, why it's important, and I'll also give you an overview of the 6 steps of service continuity planning. In the workshop, as I said, it's 5 hours long, and so we tend to go over each of the 6 steps in quite a bit of detail. But today I'll just be giving an overview of the 6 steps, so you can get a sense of what's involved and if you might want to do this work. You should have enough information to get started and get thinking about it. And if you feel like you would like to take the full-length version to access that, that more detailed methodology, we invite you to contact us to explore the possibility of setting up a workshop for your organization. So the presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So just a quick background on this program. The Service Continuity Planning Workshop was developed by the Canadian Red Cross in order to support capacity building for community organizations. This is a sector that we learned has some needs in terms of doing service continuity planning. So a lot of business continuity planning, service continuity planning guidelines are created for much larger organizations that have staff and finances to be able to do this work, to maybe have a dedicated staff person to do it. We found that there weren't a lot of tools created for really small nonprofits and organizations that serve community directly. There's also this sort of the need for this workshop, for this content, comes from the changing climate, essentially the more frequent extreme events that we're experiencing, and the change in intensity of those events is creating a need for small organizations to do this kind of planning. And so for these reasons, the Canadian Red Cross created this program, the Service Continuity Planning Workshop. So the objectives of today's presentation is to introduce essentially why is service continuity planning important for community organizations, and also to give you an understanding of the core components of service continuity planning, which will enable you to take a simplified approach to doing this work. Like I said, the workshop provides more detail and the robust methodology. Today will be an overview, but should still let you get started on this process if this is something that you would like to pursue for your organization. So, what is a service continuity plan? So I'll refer to this as an SCP going forward. So an SCP is essentially a collection of information, policies, and procedures that are compiled before an emergency, and that's key. And this type of planning can allow an organization to continue delivering services that are critical to the community well-being, or potentially to that organization's sort of operations and ability to exist. It allows service delivery to continue during a disruption or quickly resume shortly after a disruption and carry on until normal conditions or new normal conditions can resume. So I invite everyone to think about the COVID-19 pandemic, still very fresh in most of our minds, I think. And it took, so most organizations had to pivot, right? They had to find a new way of delivering their normal services in this new and disrupted environment. And so in some cases, it took businesses days. In other cases, it took them weeks to months to figure out how to do that pivot in this new environment. And so the idea of doing service continuity planning is to do some of that thinking in advance of how will we pivot in the case of a disruption, so that when a disruption occurs, we already have an idea of what we're going to be doing, how we're going to be doing it, and who's going to be doing what in this new environment. So service continuity plans are not the same as emergency response plans. So essentially, emergency response planning is all about saving lives and property. It's that immediate action that you take when an emergency occurs. So this can include activities related to alarms, evacuations, first aid supplies, sheltering in place protocols, roles like safety wardens. It's all about getting folks out of whatever the situation is, and ensuring that everyone's okay. Where service continuity planning kicks in when everyone is safe, once everyone's been evacuated and we've assessed the situation at our facility with our staff, our volunteers, our clients, and we've established that we can now shift our focus into that service provision. Excuse me. And so the focus is on service delivery in a disrupted environment, and it's really about developing resilient strategies and strategies that allow those services to keep operating. And that's what we're going to dig into in this presentation. So why do service continuity planning? So this kind of planning, by doing it in advance, can really help reduce impacts on your organization. And those impacts could be financial or material losses, disruption of services, and so on. And doing this kind of planning can really help strengthen internal and external communication. As you'll see a bit later in the presentation, really being clear about roles and having backup contact information, uh, sort of pre-existing communication messages, knowing who to contact in different situations, having all that information in place can really help ensure smooth communication with your staff, your stakeholders, your clients, the public, and so on. And having a lot of that information sort of in hand or planned up front can help reduce stress on staff and volunteers. Doing this kind of planning in advance in a way that helps service delivery sort of continue in a disrupted environment can really help preserve your organization's reputation. And while that's not necessarily the main objective of doing this work, it can be a nice side benefit. But the ultimate benefit of doing this work is that impacts on the community can be reduced. This is really what we want to accomplish here. We want to continue offering services that the community relies on so that the impact on community well-being is reduced in the case of a disruption. Communities really rely on the services offered by community organizations and nonprofits, and we want to make sure those services are continually offered, even when there's a disruption. So I've used the term service continuity, business continuity, and perhaps you're familiar with these terms as well. So I just wanted to take a second to differentiate between the two. So the underlying principles of service continuity planning, business continuity planning are similar. Service continuity planning is specifically tailored towards the sort of unique context of community organizations, nonprofits, and even small businesses. So these sectors often have a lower capacity to do this kind of work. And so the service continuity planning approach that we have developed here is meant to be simple, a little bit easier than some of the business continuity planning approaches available, which tend to focus on resuming profit generation rather than resuming service delivery. And business continuity planning can also have a strong focus on IT solutions, so data storage, access to digital documents and files, and working from home sort of technologies and softwares, where service continuity planning is really about focusing on strategies to make sure that the services and the supports needed to run them can continue. As well, the context of small community serving organizations can really be based on a volunteer base rather than a traditional workforce. And so we've really tried to create something that speaks to the context of these smaller community organizations. So I'd like to introduce the service continuity planning cycle and the 6 steps involved in this cycle. So this is what we'll be covering in the presentation today at a high level, and what we go into in a lot more detail in the full-length workshop. So the first step that we'll cover is how to build organizational support to do this work, how to get the buy-in from senior leadership and staff to make sure that this work is successful in the case of an emergency. The second step is to identify which of the services that are usually offered are the most critical to community well-being. And we'll talk about how to identify what supports underpin these critical services. What is required to actually run these services? Step 3 is about doing a risk assessment. So understanding what hazards could happen in our region, how likely are those hazards? If those hazards were to occur, what would the impacts be on our critical services? And this will tell us what are the highest risk hazards to our critical services. Step 4 involves brainstorming strategies. This is really the meat of this work, is identifying what can we do to build redundancy, to build resilience of the critical services we've identified and the supports needed to run them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to prioritize those strategies if you've come up with a really long list. Step 5 is all about putting our strategies on paper. So this is about documenting vital information, any strategies that we want to implement, as well as any procedures about how we might pivot services in different scenarios, documenting all of that so it's in one place and really coming up with a plan. And step 6, the final step, is all about getting approval for your plan, socializing it with staff and people with key roles, doing drills and exercises to test aspects of the plan, and then renewing the cycle essentially every year, potentially every 2 years, and starting again with renewing organizational support, reviewing your critical services, and so on. So we'll move on to step number 1. So how to build corporate buy-in or organizational buy-in. So this is really important to do because it's really going to help assure the long-term success of this work. Because implementing some strategies can involve budget, it can involve staff and other resources. It's important to get buy-in from senior leadership and across the organization in order to access those resources and budget. And socializing this work, getting this buy-in, is really going to help implement the plan when an emergency happens. The more people are familiar with the fact that the organization is doing this work, what's in the plan, the more successful it's going to be when you have to put this plan into action. And so we recommend doing sort of 4 different things to build that organizational support, or sort of 3 things to build that organizational support. So the first is writing a service continuity planning policy statement. So this is a statement that could be written by a senior leader or the service continuity planning lead, which I'll speak about in just a second. And the statement could say a few different things. It could provide a brief overview of what's in the plan, including some specific strategies potentially. It could speak to why it's being developed, why this is important to the organization's ability to deliver its mission. It can articulate expectations of all staff or specific staff or specific parts of the organization. And it can express a commitment to maintaining this plan going forward. So a policy statement can be a paragraph long. It could be a couple of paragraphs. It doesn't have to be extensive. And it can really be crafted to reflect what's important to your organization. So after developing a policy statement, another thing we recommend considering is identifying an SCP lead. So this is someone who would essentially be responsible for drafting the plan, consulting with different parts of the organization as necessary, and renewing the plan on an annual or maybe biannual basis. They also can act as a key contact during the disruption and can help guide the activation of the plan. We also recommend that a committee be formed if the context of your organization makes sense to do so. So a committee could be made up of, it should be made up of representation from different departments or different service lines. And the committee would assist the SCP lead in developing the plan and doing some of that consultation, providing their input on behalf of their service line to make sure that the plan reflects all different aspects of the organization. And this committee could actually be an existing committee, or it could be a brand new committee. Existing examples of existing committees that could be leveraged to do this kind of work are board of directors, stakeholder committees, occupational health and safety committees, or any committee that has representation from across different service lines. And you might consider having a committee if your organization was quite large, sort of medium to large size, or if it has multiple service lines or departments. On the other hand, if your organization is quite small, perhaps just a few employees, just a couple of service lines, you might be able to have just a lead who consults with different areas and not necessarily have a committee. And so the last component of building organizational buy-in is finding an SCP executive sponsor or a champion. So this is someone who sits in senior management who advocates for the value of doing service continuity planning. And again, they can be the author of that policy statement or a separate statement from the sponsor. But this person ideally will really go to bat at senior management tables for this work. They may argue for budget and resources to be allocated to this work, or just generally raise the topic, and so it's on people's mind. And this can really help build support to do this work. So this is step one, building organizational support through a policy statement, having an executive sponsor or champion, and identifying a lead and potentially a committee, depending on the size of the organization. So next is step two, which is all about identifying which services offered are critical and identifying what supports are required to deliver those critical services. So the reason we want to do this is that in a disruption, everybody is pulled in a lot of different directions. You may not have access to your site and your staff and your normal resources, and there's a lot of extra pressure. And so you really want to focus your staff's attention and energy on delivering services that are the most valuable, the most important to community well-being, and pause delivering services that are less critical. So again, remembering COVID, perhaps you can think of some examples of organizations where they just sort of ceased offering certain services so they could really focus on delivering just a few services. And so this is all about being really efficient with staff time and resources. So how can we figure out which of our services are the most critical ones? So what we would encourage folks to do in the workshop is to start by brainstorming all of the services offered in sort of normal times, under blue sky conditions, as we call them. So you start by listing all the services offered. And I'll give an example. So if we imagine a food bank, and the food bank offers, in normal times, 5 services. So perhaps they offer a food box pickup service, so folks can come and fill a box with food supplies. They offer a nutrition class, cooking on a budget class, and a gardening class, as well as a food box delivery to seniors service. And so these are what we call the baseline services that are offered in sort of normal conditions. Now we want to figure out which of those 5 are the most critical to community well-being. And one tool for doing that is called maximum allowable downtime, or MAD. So we can try and assign a MAD score for each of those baseline services. And here's what that can look like. So we essentially want to look at each of the services and try and figure out how long that service could be down for before harm starts happening in the community. So let's take the example of our food box delivery service to seniors. So let's assume that seniors are experiencing some vulnerability, maybe some mobility issues, and they really rely on these food boxes. And so we can say that if these seniors don't get their food boxes within, say, 12 to 24 hours, that this could pose a serious and imminent threat to their well-being. Essentially, they'll be hungry. Whereas the food box pickup service, we could say maybe if it was down for 24 to 48 hours, it would result in significant impacts, but not quite as dire as for those seniors. And the nutrition course, the gardening course, and the cooking, shopping on a budget course, if they were down for a week, they would result in minor impacts, but we would be able to get them up and running, and the harm to the community would not be that significant. And so maximum allowable downtime is one metric that you can use to identify which services are the most important. Essentially, services that, so the lower the MAD score, the shorter the amount of time the service can be down for. This means the more critical the service. So going forward, I'll carry on with this example of the food box delivery to seniors as being our most critical service. But my fictional food bank may also want to focus on that food box pickup service as a not quite as critical, but still very important service. So now that we've identified our critical service, food box delivery to seniors, we want to identify what are the supports that are required to offer this service. So we only need to focus on the bare minimum supports, what is absolutely required to offer this service. And we should think about facilities, equipment, personnel, whether that's staff or volunteers, data or records, and suppliers or vendors. So for the example I gave of food box delivery to seniors, we require cold storage for food and dry storage. We need a space to assemble the boxes. We need the boxes themselves. We need our volunteers to assemble the boxes. We need a van for delivery. And we also need data about client addresses and contact information so we know where the food is going. So these are our primary or our direct supports. But we could take this a little further and think about what is required to support, what are the secondary supports essentially? So I said cold storage. Well, we need power, electricity to make the fridges run. And so we might consider electricity as a secondary support. And for accessing data and records, we might require Wi-Fi or access to our data that's stored in the cloud. And so that's a secondary support for data and records. And so the next thing we want to do once we have the list of supports for each of our critical services, so say we had 3 critical services, we listed out the supports for each, we would want to look for any major themes. If electricity or Wi-Fi or access to a program space is showing up across all critical services, then we're really going to want to focus on those ones that support multiple services. So that is step 2, identifying which services are critical and what is required to deliver them. Step 3 is all about completing a risk assessment. And this is the most detailed step in the 6-step cycle. So I'll go into this one in a little bit more detail than the other steps. So essentially, we want to do a risk assessment because when we're developing strategies to improve the resilience of our critical services, we want to develop strategies that respond to the greatest risks. We don't want to develop strategies for every possible hazard under the sun. We really want to focus on what is most likely, and if it happened, what is most impactful on our organization. So it's really going to help us develop targeted strategies and help us focus our energy on what is going to be the most effective. So there are 4 steps to doing a risk assessment. So the first is identifying which hazards could occur in your region. So if you live in British Columbia, earthquake is a little more likely than if you live in Saskatchewan. If you live in Nova Scotia, hurricane is more likely than if you live in Toronto. So identifying what hazards could happen in your region. The next step is identifying the likelihood of that hazard occurring in your region. The third step is identifying what would the impacts on your critical services be if that hazard were to occur. And the fourth step is identifying the risk level of each hazard by combining the likelihood and the impact of those hazards. So I'll walk you through that in just a little bit more detail. So the first step, identifying hazards that can occur in your region. So I encourage you to think about 3 different types of hazards. The first is environmental hazard, and this captures what we think of as natural disasters, so flooding, heat waves, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, and so on. These can be very costly and have long-lasting impacts on organizations and their clients, especially underserved populations. 2023 and 2022 both basically severe events in 2022 and 2023 cost Canadian taxpayers $3.1 billion in insured losses. And annually, flooding causes $1.5 billion in damage annually to property in Canada. And almost 50% of losses are uninsured. Insurance is not the solution that it used to be, or that we sometimes believe it is. And so when we're thinking about environmental hazards and what could happen in our region, I recommend that you think back to your own personal experiences. Have you experienced a tornado, a hurricane, a flood in recent years? You can look at news articles, essentially search for different phenomena that have happened in your region. And another thing to remember, given the changing climate, is to look for climate data projections for your region. And these are becoming more and more common. And so these climate projections can give you a little bit of information about what kind of flooding, what kind of heat waves you might be able to expect in your region in the coming century. Another category of hazards are human-caused hazards or civil hazards. These can include things like cyber attacks, robbery, terrorism, strikes, protests, etc. And I want to draw your attention to cyber attacks in particular, because we live in an increasingly interconnected world. There's also something called the myth of security through obscurity, essentially where really small organizations feel that they are safe from cyber attacks because they're quite small. But we're finding more and more that cyber attacks can target anybody. And so this is an important one to pay attention to. And the third category is everyday hazards. And this captures sort of maintenance breakdowns, burst pipes, leaking roofs, equipment failure, sort of run-of-the-mill issues that can be managed with good maintenance. Important to consider when we're thinking about different hazards. So, as I said, we want to think about what hazards could occur in our region. So we want to start by listing those out. So maybe I live in Halifax, so I'm going to have blizzards, hurricanes, coastal flooding, probably not heat waves, cyber attack, and a robbery could happen perhaps in my neighborhood. This is a common thing. So we're going to list out all of our hazards. The next thing we're going to do is try and identify how likely each hazard is in my region. And you don't have to be a scientist to do this. In the workshop, we provide a metric for figuring out whether a hazard has a low, medium, or high likelihood of occurring in your region. And so basically, this step is all about saying whether a hazard has high, medium, or low likelihood. And when I say likelihood, I mean the probability, the chance. How likely is this thing to occur? Is it going to occur every year? In which case, that would be a high likelihood. And if it's going to occur, here we go. If it's going to occur every sort of 10 to 30 years, this might be more medium likelihood. And if it's going to occur quite rarely, maybe every 30 to 50 years, this would be a low likelihood. And these numbers, don't have to be precise. If you have a different metric for calculating likelihoods, encourage you to use this. But we're just trying to identify, is the hazard very likely, not very likely? This tells us how much attention we should pay to it. The third step is all about identifying what impact would that hazard have on your critical service if it occurred. And we want to think about impact in a few different categories, such as facility, personnel, technology, and supply chain. So here I'm showing an example of the scoring that we use. So something is low impact. If something is low impact, it gets a 1, medium impact is 2, and high impact is 3. And we're going to give a score for each of those 4 categories. So we're going to give a 1, 2, or a 3 for impacts on our facility, impacts on personnel, technology, and supply chain. So I'll show an example of how this works in just a second. And because we're giving scores in 4 different categories, we want to add those scores up, and it's going to tell us our overall score, our overall impact level. So here's an example. So say the hazard that we're looking at is a blizzard, and we've decided that in our region of Halifax, there's a very high likelihood we'll have a winter blizzard. So when it comes to facility, a blizzard poses a high impact. The roof could cave in, we can't access the site. So we're going to give that a 3 under facility. We're going to give it a score of 1 for personnel. We're going to assume that staff are still able to come into the facility, that there's been no loss of life. We're going to assume a high impact on technology. We're going to say that our power is out and our Wi-Fi is down. And the impact on our supply chain is medium at 2. We think that the supplier will be able to get here with road conditions. They might just be a little delayed. So then what happens is we essentially sum that up. And so that's a 9. And so that tells us that that is a medium. The score of 9 means that we have a medium impact level. Oh, there we go, medium. So the next step is to identify your risk level. And basically risk is the combination of the likelihood of something happening combined with the impact if that happens. So, sorry, my formatting is a bit funny here. There we go. So here's the example. So our hazard that we looked at was a blizzard. we found that the likelihood was very high in the region of Halifax, and we found that the overall impact level was a medium. And we can use this risk matrix that we see here in yellow, blue, and green to figure out our risk level. So what we want to do is we want to look at the likelihood row. So we found that the likelihood was high. So we're going to look at this top row. And we found that the impact level was medium. So we want to look at the column for medium. And we want to find where those two intersect. So where the likelihood is high and the impact is medium, this gives us a high risk highlighted here in red. That means that because a blizzard is quite likely and the impact is not insignificant, this is actually a high risk, and therefore blizzard impact on our critical service is something that we want to look at when it comes to developing strategies to protect our critical service of delivering food boxes to seniors. And so the last thing we want to do is we want to look at sort of every critical service for multiple hazards and try and figure out which hazards have the biggest impact on our different critical services. So we say we have 3 critical services. We're going to go through this sort of exercise 3 times. And we're going to document what hazards pose the highest risk to those critical services. So we really want to focus on the high risk ones because we have limited time and money, and we want to develop strategies that address those highest risks. And then if there is time and extra money, we can sort of put our attention on more medium risk hazards and then even low risk hazards. But we really want to focus on high risk. So that is step 3. Step 4 is all about brainstorming strategies. This is really the so what of this work. So now that we know that, for example, blizzards pose a really high risk to our critical service of delivering food boxes to seniors, we can figure out what do we want to do about it. So I'll give a number of examples of the kinds of things that we could think about when doing this step. So we could start by thinking about finding an alternate location. So if a blizzard means that we can't access our facility where we assemble the food boxes, we might try and find an alternate location by borrowing, moving over to sort of a peer facility, maybe a sister facility in our network, or maybe we have a relationship with a neighboring facility and we move operations over there temporarily. We could develop communication strategies. This is really going to help with service delivery when we know sort of which staff to contact, who are the backup contacts, so that we can make sure that we have folks in the different roles. We can contact our volunteers. And a communication strategy can also include sort of how we want to communicate to the public. Are we going to be using social media? Are we going to be speaking to traditional media? How are we going to get the message out that our service is disrupted or not disrupted, as the case may be? So I mentioned backup personnel. So identifying backup folks for key roles related to the critical service. Having succession strategies is another option. So if something were to happen to the CEO or the CFO, is there someone else who can step into that role who has key training? So one example for the CFO or potentially others in your organization is making sure that different people have signing authority and can sign checks and money can keep moving, that doesn't sit with just one person. Maintaining equipment can be a way to prevent sort of some of those everyday hazards from happening and make sure that, your generator works when you need it. Making sure that our data is backed up in the cloud or potentially in hard copy is another strategy. And I encourage you to think about both. Backing up in the cloud, I think is something that we do more and more. But having a hard copy might be relevant if other, digital systems go down. Having a backup with contact information or procedures or instructions can be really helpful. Having up-to-date contact list for staff, also for clients and for vendors, can make sure you are able to contact the right folks when necessary. Collaborative planning is something I'll speak about a bit more on the next slide, but essentially, how can you work with other organizations to share information and resources? We encourage you to have backup equipment. So perhaps this is a backup energy supply, like a generator. Perhaps it's backup cleaning supplies or craft supplies or what have you, whatever is required to deliver your service. You may also want to consider having inventory stored off-site. So in the food bank example, perhaps we want to rent out a space elsewhere and store a lot of dry goods and canned goods. So if something happens to our facility, we can't access it, or there's a flood or the roof caves in, we still have access to some food that we can put in boxes to give to seniors. Annual training and exercises is another way to make sure that services are rolled out smoothly, essentially ensuring that staff know, if X happens, then we will pivot and deliver the service in this way. Or if there's an emergency, we will we will evacuate in this way. We'll move to our new alternate location in this way. So that training can help things go more smoothly. So I'll speak just a bit more about this idea about collaborative planning. So a really great resource that community organizations have often is other community organizations. Many community organizations have limited resources, and so pooling those resources or sharing them, exchanging them, can be a strategy to help each of those organizations or multiple organizations deliver services. And so you could essentially contact another organization and see if there's an opportunity to share equipment or supplies. So essentially, my food bank will loan the daycare some boxes that they need to do whatever activity. I may find another organization who can serve as an alternate location, or they would let us share their location. So maybe, it's a daycare, but the daycare only runs certain hours. And so in the evening, we could assemble our food boxes in the daycare space. Supply sharing, I sort of mentioned this already, but is there, I can't access my site, so I can't access my craft supplies or my foodstuffs. Can we borrow yours? Fleet sharing, we can't access our van. There's been an accident. Can we borrow your van to deliver the food boxes? And information sharing is a really powerful one. I've been working with some community organizations in Toronto who sit around a table and sharing information around COVID testing and COVID vaccines was really useful in order to combat misinformation that was going around. And so they were able to access an expert and share that expertise with a large group of organizations. Was really valuable for them in terms of serving the community. One thing to consider when thinking about sharing resources with other organizations is that you may want to find someone who's in a slightly different geographic area. So in the event that the emergency you experience is really localized, you're having localized flooding because you're near a river, or you're, near a sort of an area that gets a lot of rainfall, and there's sort of flooding from that. Having someone in a different neighborhood who is not experiencing flooding can be a helpful strategy so that you're not both sort of experiencing the same thing and not able to help each other. And you may want to consider having an MOU or a service agreement in place in advance, saying, organization A will give organization B these supplies unless, X happens, and we will or we will not exchange money, as the case may be. So when we come up with strategies, we want to brainstorm a list of strategies. This is basically the bulk of step 4 is brainstorming. What are the things we can do to protect the critical services? So in the case of my example, we're going to find an organization where we can assemble boxes if something happens to our facility. We're going to buy a generator so that we can keep the fridge running. If we lose power, we're going to make sure that our cardboard boxes are not stored in the basement in case there's a flood. They're sort of above ground. We're going to make sure we have backup contact information for all of our volunteers, contact information for our volunteers as well as backup volunteers in case the original set aren't available. We're going to make sure that we have our client contact information stored in hard copy as well as in the cloud. And those hard copies are going to be distributed to, say, 3 different staff. They're not going to be kept on site. And we're going to build an inventory of dry goods off site. So say these are the strategies that I come up with right off the bat. These are all great strategies, but maybe my food bank doesn't have enough money to implement all of them right away. So we need to figure out which strategies are going to be the most effective to deliver, to reduce the risk to this critical service. So we recommend prioritizing them by thinking about basically doing a cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis is a whole sort of methodology that can be quite complicated. So we've created sort of a simplified approach based on the feasibility and the effectiveness of different strategies. So a strategy is feasible if the resources required to implement it are affordable, available, easy to access. Something is not feasible if it's expensive, complicated, involves a lot of people, takes a lot of time. And a strategy is effective if it directly and substantially reduces risk. And it's ineffective if it doesn't do that much to reduce risk. And so kind of like the risk matrix, we're going to look at a feasibility effectiveness matrix. So if a strategy, and we're going to do again, like find that intersection point on this matrix. So essentially, if a strategy is highly effective and highly feasible, so in other words, it's pretty easy to do, it's not that expensive, it's not that complicated, doesn't require a lot of staff, and it's really going to help us protect that critical service. So like moving the cardboard boxes out of the basement. It's really easy and it's really going to help us, be able to deliver boxes. Then this is so high effectiveness, high feasibility. This is a high priority strategy. We want to do these ones right away. These are our low hanging fruit. Whereas if a strategy is, it's highly effective, but it's not as feasible, it's a little more expensive, it involves buying equipment, it's a little more complicated. We recommend, so this would be a medium priority strategy, and we recommend that you develop a plan to implement this one. So for example, buying a generator to keep the fridge running, highly effective, but very expensive for the small organization. We need to develop a plan about how we're going to finance that. Maybe we're going to fundraise, maybe we're going to reallocate budget, but we need a bit of time to figure this one out. So this is going to be our sort of secondary strategies. We're going to work at these over a longer time horizon. If something is highly effective, not very effective, but it's quite easy, then this is also medium priority strategy, but this is, we recommend doing these as resources allow. Perhaps you have a summer student or an intern or just some free time at some point in the year. These are good strategies to tackle when you can. And then if a strategy is not effective and it's not feasible, don't do it. So that wraps up step 4. So now ideally we have strategies that are tailored to the hazards that are the highest risk. So if blizzard is the highest risk, we want strategies that are going to protect our food box delivery to seniors from blizzards. And then we're going to prioritize them using this matrix. So step 5 is all about putting it on paper. So this is about, you might want a flow chart to say, if an emergency happens, we will do this, then we will do this. That's an option. You'll want to document and contact info for vendors and suppliers, contact information for your comms people, your IT people. You may want to generate sort of canned or pre-developed communication messages for different mediums like social media or traditional media. You also want a staffing and volunteer plan. So for those critical services, what are the roles involved? How many of each role and who does them? And who is the backup person that we're going to call if the primary person's not available? We're going to document where our alternate location is, if that's something we've opted for. Is there parking? What's the security code? What's the Wi-Fi? Anything about the alternate information or alternate location? And we want to document anything to do with really important assets, equipment like generators. Where's the generator? Where's the fuel? Who knows how to run it? We have 3 trucks and the license plates are XYZ. Our insurance policy number is this. And so this is all about putting things on paper so that when an emergency happens, you have it all at your fingertips. And important to think about whether you want to have this in a hard copy or stored in the cloud, and also important to think about who has access to it, particularly if it includes confidential client contact information or other confidential information. So the last step is all about putting it into action. So once we've put all of this information on paper, so our vital information, as well as any strategies we're pursuing or any procedures that we're going to implement. So for example, if we can't access the facility, we will move to the alternate location, and senior manager A will make that decision. You write all that down. So once you've got all that on paper, you want to seek approval from senior management. Once it's approved, you want to socialize the plan with staff. So this could be all staff or it could be staff with key roles. It's essentially letting folks know this plan exists and that they have a role or not, as the case may be. You'll want to undertake training so that folks with key roles understand what they are to do in the case of an emergency in terms of pivoting that service to, say, an alternate location or moving to virtual service delivery. You want to conduct exercises and drills and review the plan. And you want to give some thought to where the plan is stored, who has access to it. And then you will kick off the cycle of planning again, going through the 6 steps. And I see we're very close to time here, but just a quick note on the importance of doing drills and exercises. Trial by fire is rarely successful. So when you put all of this on paper and you've developed some strategies and some procedures for pivoting services, testing these out is really going to help this go smoothly when the time comes. Can help you develop weak points. There's lots of different exercises that you can do, from just sort of sitting with your plan as a group and talking through and seeing if there's any weak points, to doing a sort of tabletop exercise where you have a scenario and you're going to sort of actually test out something like a phone tree, or you're going to go to the alternate location and see how smoothly that goes, all the way up to an organizational exercise, which is a real mock simulation or a mock emergency. These can be quite resource intensive, and you need to make sure that everyone knows that it's just a drill. And anytime there is an actual emergency or you do a drill, after action reviews can really help identify those weak points. So these are the 6 steps of service continuity planning. It's all about building organizational support, figuring out which of the services you normally offer are the most critical and what supports are required to operate those services, identifying which hazards pose the greatest risk to your critical services, brainstorming strategies to protect those supports, and then prioritizing them based on feasibility and effectiveness, putting a lot of information on paper, and then socializing it, training, and reviewing the plan on an annual basis, or perhaps every 2 years, but on a regular basis. So these are the 6 steps of service continuity planning. And everyone's plan can look a little bit different. In the workshop, we do provide a template that can be used, but really every organization is going to look a little bit different in terms of what information they document, what strategies they document, and what procedures they put in place. But if you follow these 3 steps, then we believe that you can get a good deal of the way towards having some plans in place that will protect your critical services and let you continue delivering them in the case of a disruption. And just start where you are, start small. It's okay to iterate. You don't have to come up with a really complex plan right off the bat. Just start by documenting what you have in place already and then adding to it as you implement strategies is a perfectly acceptable way to go. And with that, I will wrap up the presentation and answer any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen as well.
That was great. Thanks, Emily. I've been monitoring the chat as well, and it's so great to see so many folks from all across the country. So a wide diversity of geographic representation in terms of community organizations are here. That's wonderful. There is a question. What are some examples of situations to plan for when developing the plan?
Right, so this is where step 3, the risk assessment, is all about identifying what hazards are likely in your area. So in the example I gave, blizzards were something that this fictional food bank in Halifax identified as a hazard. And it turns out, because of the likelihood of it happening is quite high and the impact on the critical service we identified was medium, that this is something we really wanted to pay attention to. Essentially, it's a high-risk hazard. And so we would develop our strategies to respond to blizzards. And so this would be about, if a blizzard is going to make the roof cave in or make the roads to the site inaccessible, we're going to want to come up with an alternate location. And we're going to want to have inventory of food, dry goods stored off-site. And the reason we want you to do that risk assessment is so you don't come up with strategies for hazards that aren't very likely, or if they happen, that they won't have a serious impact. It's all about, sort of being making good use of your time and your resources, developing strategies for only the highest risk hazards.
Someone just mentioned that they're grateful for sharing this step by step as it supports understanding how to deal with each step in a logical fashion. So that's great. Someone also noted that a challenge, I think, in their particular geography is theft of copper tubing from oil tank lines, which is potentially another risk for their organization.
Exactly. And that's an example of like a human induced or a civil hazard, not an environmental hazard. And so um, if that was related to running a critical service, then you might find, I'm not an expert in, in machinery, but this might involve securing the equipment by building a fence or putting a lock or putting it in a box or securing it indoors so that that theft is not as easy. Perhaps there's a different piece of equipment that doesn't have that copper tubing that you could replace it with. Um, or maybe it's all about, if you can't because of the facility or the piece of equipment, perhaps there's nothing you can do to stop the theft. Maybe it's about allocating extra budgets so that you can make sure you can always replace it when it's stolen. That's a less ideal strategy, of course, but I think, you're on the right track if identifying, that you need this piece of equipment's really critical for a service and you've identified the hazard. Now it's all about figuring out what is the strategy to try and prevent those thefts.
That's great. We've had a couple of questions about getting certified in service continuity planning. And so this webinar is simply the introduction to a larger workshop. And Emily, if folks are interested in getting certified, how does that look like?
So taking the workshop, we recommend it. Like I said, we go into more detail on all of these steps. Um, a certificate is not provided as part of that. That's something we could explore internally. So I'll make a note of that. There may be other certifications out there, and I believe there are specifically for business continuity. But we can certainly look into creating some kind of certificate at minimum, an email saying that you completed the workshop. That's a great idea.
Thank you to the folks who suggested that and are interested in getting certified. And absolutely, this recording will be available. So we will send it to all participants and registrants, and we will also upload it to our YouTube channel. So you will receive an email with that by the end of the week with this recording to be able to support sending this to the powers that be, as someone just said in the chat. So that's great. Yeah. It's a great tool to help push it forward. I think there are no more questions. Um,
April, can I
and
give
so,
a tiny plug
yes,
for the Ready Rating webinar that we are doing tomorrow? This is a really great tool, readyrating.ca. I invite you to come to that webinar, but if you're not able to make it, I recommend that you explore readyrating.ca. This is a Canadian Red Cross website that is designed to help community organizations and businesses do emergency preparedness planning. So not the service continuity planning side as much, but that traditional emergency preparedness planning. It's a really great resource, and I encourage folks to check that out. Thanks.
I second that plug. I just have dropped the webpage in the chat for folks to register, and that's happening tomorrow at the same time. So it's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. So we hope to see folks there. Okay, that's great. Emily, I think we're done. I think we're good. Any last thoughts or
That's
comments?
it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Take care. Have a great day.